this is Terry Burns. I'm here with Laurie, Graney, and Kristal Prohaska at the Platteville Senior Center, and we are going to talk about the mysteries of Indian Park. As some of you know, we originally presented on this back in February before COVID-19 hit, and so we're going to summarize parts of that presentation so you don't have to go back and see the whole thing. It is still online in 3 parts in YouTube, and written it up on my blog as an article, driftlessroadtrip.com, Mysteries of Indian Park, and obviously there will be a video of this one since that's probably what you're watching. Okay. Indian Park is here in Platteville on 4th Street. There's its sign. If you've ever wondered about that, established in 1917, that date relates to when it became a park, not to the specific name of the park. It was then briefly called Cemetery Park, then Roundtree Park, a bunch of other names that we'll get into. But in 1917, the state legislature granted the city of Platteville the right to, quote, take care of the grounds therein. And from 1917 on, thereafter, the use of said lands for interment shall be prohibited, and the title thereto shall be vested in the said city of Platteville. What we're going to see in this presentation is that the years 1917 and 1918 are real important to what happens in the park. In 1918, the city council voted to remove all of the bodies from the park and rebury them in Greenwood Cemetery. The problem is there's no record that it was ever done, and for the case of some of the cholera victims buried there, we know that it definitely was not done. Also notice 1918 was during the Spanish flu epidemic, so probably in the middle of a flu epidemic, digging up cholera burials, actually even if it weren't the Spanish flu, probably isn't something people are going to be real thrilled about doing. But anyway, the idea was, even though it was not carried through, that after all the bodies were removed, it would become Roundtree Park, and briefly did. And the Roundtree Park Committee is authorized and empowered to level the surface of the ground and to erect fences on the north and south sides of said park, and that the expense thereof be borne by the city. When we presented back in February, there were several people in the audience that remembered there being an iron fence both on the sides of the park and one in the center. More trees there and so forth. And yes, right between those 2 gaps of text is where, according to legend, there is a, quote, Indian buried there. We're going to look into the veracity of that claim. The timeline, which is a lot more detailed, is also online. For those of you who don't know where Indian Park is, it's right in the middle of town there. We're here at the Platteville Senior Center. There's Lewis Street, named after Reverend John Lewis, who we'll be talking about, 4th Street, Court Street. Okay, so the legend is that the name comes from a, quote, Indian buried in the center. So what's the likelihood of that? Well, before 1841, first of all, the name use of this specific parcel of land is unknown. We'll get through all the different names in a moment. But it makes no sense to connect that legend to any kind of recent grave. That is, if there is anyone buried in the center, that would seem to indicate it's a conical mound, not a recent burial. Many people have thought that the rise in the center of the park was a conical mound. There used to be at least 2 elementary school teachers that would walk their classes over there from O.E. Gray and talk about the importance of not walking on the mound. Kristal Prohaska remembers that when she was in elementary school. This is how Effigy Mounds National Monument describes this type of mound. And conical mounds are just round, dome-shaped mounds, 3 to 10 feet high, about 10 feet across. Some can be bigger, some can be smaller. Now at Indian Park, that sidewalk that you saw around it would also be part of what we're speculating is a mound. And we'll try to be very careful in this presentation about what we're speculating about and what we can claim is definitely true. So in the early 1800s, this area was Ho-Chunk or Ho-Chungra territory, although there were no known permanent settlements here. A variety of evidence, such as 17 natural springs in the area, other geological features like hills, ravines, and a profusion of archaeological finds, makes us speculate that Indian Park and the surrounding area was a meeting and trade place in addition to a place where women mined lead, because of course with the Ho-Chunk it would be women and children mining lead and not deep shafts into the earth. It was mainly on the surface. But the mound building culture is not Ho-Chunk, although the Ho-Chunk and others claim descent from this culture. The reason for the creation of conical, linear, and effigy mounds in southwest Wisconsin remains a mystery to this day, though it's one that gradually people are learning more and more about, and particularly the Ho-Chunk have been willing to say more about what they know, since again they consider themselves descendants. Also the Iowa and some other local tribes, but specifically the Ho-Chunk have teachings about the effigy mound culture. Native and non-native archaeologists today assume that conical mounds connect as much or more to native cosmology as to burial, since there are mounds that don't contain burials. So almost all conical mounds are over 750 years old. The oldest, it says here 2,500, that's one source, and another says 3,000 years. That is, we're not going to find a record in some old newspaper saying a Ho-Chunk person by this name is buried there. And these are likely to be over 1,000 years old. So let's look at some of the names for Indian Park. It was an unnamed, as far as we English speakers know, land before European settlers came here, but then it was a Presbyterian burial ground, the Presbyterian Congregationalist burial ground. Then it was called Hill Cemetery and Hill Graveyard. This comes from the first newspaper in Platteville, the Independent American, run by city founder Major John Roundtree. So it's first referred to as Hill Cemetery as a well-kept place, and then the very year after, there's a letter to the editor writing in and complaining. At that time, it was one of only 2 burial grounds. The other one may be under, like, where the post office is. We're not sure about that, but it was one of only 2 graveyards, and the graveyards that currently exist here did not exist then, other than Indian Park. Then it was called a cemetery. Imagine that. Eventually it becomes lots 9, 10, 19, and 20 of Covell's addition, and then the same except cemetery is added into the reference, or Presbyterian burying ground. It's also called a cemetery and graveyard around the turn of the century before last. It's referred to as public property. Someone's calling the senior center. You can probably hear the phone in the background. And Indian Park from at least 1912 and multiple times since, though not necessarily in an official capacity. Also in 19, it's referred to as Cemetery Park, Roundtree Park. Then by 1929, it is North Park, multiple times through 1961. It's called Children's Park in 1938. Now that's from, according to the city of Platteville, that's from a Fenimore Times article, and I can't really tell you anything about the history of that particular name like the others. Sometimes it's called 4th Street Park, informally, so then in city records it's once referred to as 4th Street Park, also known as North Park and Indian Park is its current name. Few, if any, current residents seem to remember any name but Indian Park. On our Friends of Indian Park Facebook group, which you're welcome to join, Thomas Bowl, I believe, pointed out that from 1942 on, he didn't think it had been referred to as any other name. If you look at some popular walking tour sorts of books like this one that came out in 1998, you can see, if you take a walking tour of Indian Park, it's described as an unmarked cemetery and cholera burial ground. The same is true in this book, 2 Tours of Historic Platteville, which was put together in the early 80s based on Eagle Scout projects And this, you can still buy this at the mining museum for $1. It's quite a deal. But here's the history they give for the park there. That John Roundtree gave this land to the city of Platteville. We'll look at that in a moment. Thomas Payne Aiken, who died in 1850 of cholera, was buried in this park. We'll look a little bit at his history. And the block of land has been left unmarred by the advance of civilization because the graves must not be moved due to the fact that the victims died of cholera. So that was the research of an Eagle Scout back in the 70s, and is absolutely correct. There are several mysteries that we were exploring during our last presentation. One was the mound in the center. Is it a conical mound, a burial mound, and also something we didn't bring up then but intended to be part of this one, is there more than one mound? Who other than 1812 veteran Thomas Aiken and his son William Aiken's fiancée Eleanor Donaldson are buried there? Why were cholera victims put in a park in the center of town? That last question we'll answer because it's pretty easy. It wasn't the center of town then, it was way out on the outskirts of town. There's a mystery stone we'll talk about on the north side. We'll speculate a little about what it might say, although we're not sure. And then finally, why were there so many oddities and how the property deeds for this part of town were recorded? That's one of the things I think that makes this such an important historical property. It seems to intersect with the major national and local political currents of the time from when the park started all the way through the end of the Spanish flu. This is the mystery stone I talked about. It's on the north side of the park, near the houses on that side. And if you can read what it says there, please let us know, because Laurie, Kristal, and I have been trying to read that for quite a while. Eric Flesch, the director of the Mining Museum, has chimed in to help us. We'll get to some of his suggestions, and we'll look at one from 1962 a little bit later in this presentation. But let's look at some of the context beyond Indian Park. First of all, this is native land. The Ho-Chunk, Ho-Chungra, Winnebago people lived in this area, but the mound builders predate the Ho-Chunk. Usually rather than saying Indian Park, maybe you'd say the name of the tribe that lived there, but no one knows who the mound builders were. There are later names applied to them. And as I mentioned, most conical mounds are over 1,000 years old, and the Ho-Chunk consider themselves descendants. And they also consider the mounds sacred places. Early on in the history of Platteville, there was a smallpox epidemic. Then there was a cholera epidemic. The cholera epidemic claimed a lot of victims, including other people in Thomas Aiken's family, his son's fiancée. During the peak of the epidemic, the only paper in town, that is Roundtree's Independent American, didn't print, so there aren't any existing obituaries. That was one thing we'd wondered about. Why couldn't we find obituaries? Well, there's simply the paper didn't exist. The sexton's records for the church don't go back that far, much less to the smallpox deaths. So luckily, oops, I went ahead too quick. Luckily though, there was a federal index of who died connected to the 1850 census, and we'll get to that in a moment. Platteville at that time seemed split between anti-slavery and pro-slavery or no-opinion churches, and that's going to directly affect this property, as well as the history of Platteville Academy, which, as you may know, became the normal school and then UW-Platteville. So it's very important in the history of this city. So what we're going to do is, for the most part, we want to go from facts to what is likely to what is possible. But the exception to this, since there's been so much interest in it, is the mound in the center. We'll introduce the issues surrounding that right at the beginning, and then we'll return to it again at the very end. We want to put events in a historical context. We're hoping that this will be considered, will get a local historic designation. And so it's always important to look at it in terms of local, regional, and sometimes national history. So, here's Indian Park. Then that in the center was the, in fact, I'll go back to that for a second. All right, that's not all of what we are speculating could be a conical mound. And by the way, the only way to really prove that, since there are no written records, would be to do ground penetrating radar. But this sidewalk here is also, it's not level. So you can think of it, this is something going all the way across, and there used to be around there a fence. This is a teaching map used for some of the mounds and studying them in Dane County, right there. And what you probably notice, here we are in Grant County. Grant County and Dane County have the highest concentration of conical, linear, and effigy mounds in the state. And on top of that, this part of Wisconsin has the highest concentration of effigy mounds in the world. Not the state, not the country, but in the world. Most of them have been destroyed. But there are still quite a few left, and the easiest way to visit them is probably Effigy Mounds National Monument or up at Wyalusing State Park. Here's some resources on that if you're interested. Patty Lowe, who's an Anishinaabe and also was on the UW-Madison faculty, or was or is, wrote this excellent book, Indian Nations of Wisconsin. It talks briefly about the mounds. This one talks about exclusively the mounds. And this gentleman, Robert Birmingham, was for 15 years the state archaeologist, and his co-author is also an archaeologist. Robert Birmingham came out with another book focused just on the mounds in Dane County, looking at the cosmology. I'm going to talk about how mounds connect to native cosmology at the very end of this presentation, but you can see here examples of, say, a conical mound, a linear mound. Effigy mounds are shaped like something identifiable, the most famous being the Marching Bears group over at Effigy Mounds National Monument. This is the lead ranger at Effigy Mounds National Monument, and some of what he taught me that I'm going to be referring to when I discuss cosmology. He also wrote the 38-page report when they found that they hadn't really been treating the burials there the right ways. That is, they were literally in a garage because no one knew how to repatriate them to a tribal group because the tribal groups no longer existed, so they were kept in a garage. From the fallout of this, they've done some excellent teaching work up there. I wrote to the Ho-Chunk Nation's Historic Preservation Officer, William Quackenbush, and found that he'd been contacted about this mound before. And this is what he wrote back to the three of us. He thanked us for contacting the Ho-Chunk Nation, but I want to draw your attention here. We were asking about whether or not this mound should be, if it were a conical mound, near water or up on a bluff. And now, as we'll see, it was near water, but he thinks that's a misconception. And I will just let his words speak for themselves. Burial mounds are more apt to be placed where the individual or family preferred them to be placed. And of course, later he points out something I've already said, which is that not all mounds are burial mounds. So, quickly, how they can reflect a cosmology. To talk about this, I'm going to use an example from Iowa County. Mountains are very difficult to photograph, but this is, the Pineal Church is here, and these are what are called water panthers. Water panthers are associated with a particular clan and a particular clan's obligation. Springs, though, are often considered the opening to the underworld. So, and there are springs not super near this, but, you know, farther away, and also a river. This is an old map of the marching bears in Effigy Mound National Monument. First of all, the bears could correspond to the Bear Clan, who were the protectors of the earth, and members of the Bear Clan were never involved in treaty negotiations for that reason. But also, you may know in Western cosmology, the bear, Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, in the Big Dipper, Little Dipper, that actually is very similar, coincidentally, in Ho-Chungra cosmology. The Bear Clan would be connected to the Big Dipper, and actually this linear mound here on the summer solstice lines up with the Big Dipper. Talking about water and whether a mound ought to be near water, Indian Park used to be near a lot of water. So one thing I think important to do with talking about this area in general is to think about what it looked like at that time. Now, this article, written in 1917, one of the key years in looking at Indian Park, this article was written by Mr. Evans about what Platteville looked like 90 years before then. I've typed up the whole article, and I'll put a link below so that you can find it online. But the part right in here about the area on 4th Street, I mean, after talking about the big ravines and the main street and so on, here is the part that talks about 4th Street. And since that's kind of hard to read, I'll just read it to you. He writes, west of the city, along the marshy ravine which headed near the present 4th Street, there were many springs. First in order was the Hard Knocks, then came the Dozier Spring, which afforded water for the cows in pastures as late as 10 years ago, it's 1907. On the Grendel property, a spring for a time furnished water for the manufacture of brick. Further west, on the H.S. Roundtree lot, there was a spring with a large flow, furnishing abundant water for stock. Near this spring, the village boys of 60 years ago, screened by abundant timber, had built a dam to impound water for a swimming hole. Of course, they would have been swimming naked, hence the screened by abundant timber. For a few seasons, this afforded the kids a fine bathing pool. Just on the south of Adams Street, there was a spring notable in early times as a camping place of immigrants and gypsies. Further down the ravine, there were springs on the Shepherd lot, the Odin lot, the Charles Nye lot, the Homer Perry lot, and the Karsten lot. Doubtless there were others. Most of them have been drained by the shafts sunk for mining. But in other words, the area where Indian Park is now was probably at the part of Platteville where there were the most springs, and it was definitely near water. This, here are some words from Ho-Chunk elder Cloris Lowe. This is over again at Effigy Mounds National Monument, and he writes, "We ask that as you walk over this land, please remember this is sacred ground to those of the mound building culture. The descendants of this culture are not a lost people, but rather a living, thriving American Indian cultures that today reside in what is now called the Midwest. These native descendants continue to honor their ancestors buried here in religious ceremonies on these sacred sites. Please enjoy and respect your time among the old ones, as their spirits will watch over you while you're here." This area of Indian Park being sacred ground, both to Native people and to the settlers who came later, and the veteran, at least one of them buried there, and the victim of the cholera epidemics, is something that will frame the rest of our presentation. We'll see later that a bit of fill has been added. This was a picture taken by Kristal Prohaska, and you can see under this new sidewalk, there was an old sidewalk, and this much fill. And we're so glad Kristal was out there to take that picture. But if you add this amount to the base of that mound in the middle, it's easily more than 3 feet tall.